There we go. So let me know if anybody else pops in. I've got the chat, and hopefully, so if anybody could just let me know if you can't see my screen, let me know. But otherwise, the screen is clear. Thank you so much. I am definitely going to get people's names wrong, so please do forgive me if I get people's pronunciations wrong. I'll do my best. So yeah, as Asad said, I'm Jen. I work for the UK Equator Centre at the University of Oxford. So after doing a PhD in biochemistry, I moved into academic copy editing, first for work privately and now for the Equator Network, the UK Equator Centre, and I teach academic writing skills. So I mentioned, and so did Asad mention, the Equator Network, which stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research, which we do by improving the quality of health research writing. The idea being that all of the research that you do is based on existing literature. So by improving how people write about their research today, we're ensuring better quality research tomorrow. And we do this in 3 ways. We raise awareness of tools called reporting guidelines, which I'll talk more about later. We host a website for including all of the reporting guidelines available for human research. And we offer education and training, which is why I'm here today. And just a huge thank you to Cancer Research UK, whose funding supports the UK Equator Centre's programme of research and training. So just a few bits of housekeeping. One, you should all have a handout with the key points from today's session. Please let Azad know if you don't have it, and he can email it out to you. So just pop it in the chat box if you don't have the handout yet. 2, interaction. I know this is always really tricky doing training across remotely, but it's still great if we can be interacting with each other. I'd love to hear from you. So please just pop your questions and your comments in the chat box as we go along, and I'll do my best to keep track of it and to answer your questions as we go. And then 3, feedback. Please let me know if I'm talking too quickly or too slowly, or if there's any technical glitches. So let's just keep chatting along in the chat box. So let's get going with today's session. So I've been hearing that you've been in this training workshop number 10 about doing research, and we're now at the point of you've done a piece of health research, whatever the type, whether it's a systematic review, whether it's lab research, whether it's research with human participants, you've done some piece of health research. Oh, hang on, I'm going to just enter some people from the waiting room. There we go, got a few more people in. So you've done some piece of health research, whatever the type, and you now want to share it with the world, because you know that the only way that health research can improve lives is if it is shared, right? So it's the only way it can improve lives. But how do you go from that big results and conversations with your research team, how do you go from that to a polished manuscript that's ready for submission? That's what we're going to cover across the next hour. And the main message I want to give to you over the next hour, and just in case you need to leave a little bit early, which is totally fine, I've got 3 big key points. First, planning. The most useful thing that you can do is to make a solid plan first that all of your co-authors agree on. And 2, that you don't have to do this from scratch. There are lots of tools and guidelines to help you. And finally, at every stage, you need to run everything you do past your co-authors to get everybody on board with each stage. So before we jump into how that all works, I'd love to hear from you as to what your experience with writing about research is. And I'd love to hear your answers in the comment box. So you can pick one of the options that's already there, or you can type in a little bit more if you'd like to give some more detail. Have you never worked on a research paper? Have you been involved in some papers but not led one? That's B. C, have you led some paper writing? Pop it in the box so I can see what you've all been up to before, while I admit a few more people from our waiting room. B, so Balqis has been involved. Great. Heber's been involved. Ali, great. Oh, we've got a whole bunch coming in with A's. Ali, Ustra, Ala, Akwaba. You're going to have to help me pronounce the name. Small C, I've done that. I love that response. C. So this is great. We've got a really wide range. Amazing. Great. So a few folks have been involved with research. Some people have led some paper writing, which is awesome. We've got a bunch of people who've never worked on a research paper before, which is really great. It's awesome to hear from so many people and a wide range of experiences, which means that it will be really great to hear from you as we go along, to share your experiences at each stage, whether you find something you go, oh, I've done that before, it worked really well for me, or oh, I've never done that before, I'd love to try it as we go along. Great. So last few people. Right, so I'm going to take you through a 10-step process for submitting, preparing a manuscript for submission. So 10 steps. The first 5 of which are all to do with planning. Remember, that was one of our key points, that planning is so important. So step 1 is to figure out your message. Before you do anything else, figure out the message for this paper. And that message is the story that you want to convey in this one piece. And to find your story, you need to answer 4 big questions. Firstly, what didn't we know before you did this piece of research? What didn't we know? What was the evidence gap? What was the problem? What was the tension? Secondly, what did you do? So to tackle that evidence gap, what did you do? What did you find? And what does it mean? And you might be saying, well, that sounds quite straightforward. I've done the research. But the challenge is you need to do that in just 2 to 5 sentences in informal, comfortable language. That lets you really hone in on what the actual message is. And it's essentially, if you were sitting next to somebody at a dinner party and they said, so tell me about what your next paper is going to be on, paper in just those few 2 to 5 sentences to let you hone in. And we'll just let these last folks in. There we go. You might be thinking, but the message is going to be super obvious, right? Those 4 big questions are essentially the questions you use to design research. But if you've been working on a really big, involved piece of work, chances are you're not going to fit it all into one paper. So it's useful to know what of the work is going in this paper. And if you're working on something smaller, it's still helpful to make sure everyone agrees what the story actually is. It's surprising how often different folks involved in a paper actually have quite different ideas of where they think it's going to go before we start writing. So once you've got the message of this paper down, you've written it down. This is the most important part with planning, actually writing this stuff down, not just having the chat, writing it down. Take it to your team and make sure everybody agrees. So that's going to be really crucial for what we're doing, is that every time we're going to take it all back to our co-authors to make sure that everybody agrees. So that is step 1, getting the message. Once you've got the message, leads us into step 2, figuring out authorship. So we need to figure out authorship. I have a question for you. When do you think we should discuss authorship? So when should we talk about authorship? Loe says at the end. Balkwe says from the beginning. Shahid says right from the start. Before we start, says Allah. Yes, great. This is a really nice range. And I agree with you. Yes, we should be talking about authorship when we plan the work. When we plan the work. When you're talking about the research, at that stage, you want to be talking about whether somebody's contribution is going to merit authorship at that stage, so that there's no confusion and people know what they're signing up for. At this point, after the research has been done and we're planning the paper, we're having a conversation, conversation. We're talking about whether folks should be involved as authors based on this paper. So at this point, we're saying, does each person qualify for this particular paper? So some people involved in a much bigger study might not qualify for authorship for this particular paper, even though their contribution to the overall study might make them qualify for a different paper. And also, really important is each person still interested in being an author? Some people might not want to be involved in the paper at all and might rather choose acknowledgement, which is a valid choice. So if we think about this, we've got to remember that there are guidelines as to who qualifies as an author. And yes, it does depend on the level of participation, as I said in the chat, right? We have to remember that there's guidelines who qualifies, and you're all likely to be publishing in journals that are likely to be falling under the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is ICMJE. It's their recommendations for authorship. So for each potential co-author, we have to make sure that they meet criterion number 1. So this is after the study's been done. Did they substantially contribute to the study? And in your handout, you've got the full definition of what that substantially contributes mean. So were they substantially involved in some element of conceiving, designing, or doing the work? So you have to be substantially involved. And then we have to check, are they prepared to meet criteria 2 to 4? Are they prepared to be involved in either writing or involved in editing or revising that paper? Because that's criteria number 4 to be an author. Then are they happy to be around to approve that final version? Why would someone not prefer to be in the authorship? Great question. So for instance, you may have had a student that's been involved and they were in your lab, they did a bit of work, they've left, and you get back in touch with them to say, we're going to start writing the paper. Or do you want to be an author? And they say, oh, I'm actually going to be really busy doing all of these other things and I have no interest in reading that paper ever. So I don't want to even read it. So no, I don't want to be an author. So somebody might say that. It's unusual, but it's always worth giving people the choice, right? So approve final version. And then the last criteria is that you need to be accountable for the work. But yes, I would agree. It's really unusual that somebody doesn't want to be an author, but we still need to give people the choice. And if somebody meets criterion 1 and doesn't want to do the rest, you acknowledge them. If somebody comes in at stage 2 and can't go back in time and be essentially involved in the work, so they just help with writing, then it's also just acknowledgement. When it comes to authorship order, there are no written guidelines really. But in biomedical research, we usually use the order of contribution, where the first author did most of the work or the writing, and the last author conceived and oversaw the work. So that's usually what we use. You can use lots of other ways of doing authorship order. If you do something unusual, just pop it into your acknowledgement section to explain what you did. And once again, once you've finalized your authorship, make sure everybody in the team is happy. Everybody needs to be happy with the proposed authorship list and the proposed authorship order. Point we can get going really with planning out this manuscript. So now we can figure out our audience. We're going to figure out our audience. So in any piece of writing, you need to know who you are writing for. Who is this particular message for? So thinking about health research, can you name some potential audiences for a piece of health research writing? Can anybody name a few potential audiences? Think about either a paper that you're working on. Healthcare professionals, yes, that's definitely one of our potential audiences. Healthcare workers, yes. Community, yes. Thinking beyond healthcare. Medical students, yes, these are great. Doctors, yes. Great, these are some really lovely audiences. These are definitely people that we can think of. Lab technicians, awesome. So these are all different folks who could be interested in reading a piece of health research writing. Yes, researchers, for all, exactly. Even if we are thinking for all, we want to get specific. This is where it's going to get interesting. We want to try and get as specific as possible. We say other researchers. Great. When we say other researchers, who are we thinking? Are we thinking trialists? Maybe we've got an intervention and it's ready for clinical trial. Maybe we're thinking systematic reviewers. We're doing a piece of work that would go really well into systematic review. We're doing a clinical trial. Maybe we're thinking lab researchers. Think about exactly who you want to be reading this piece of research. When we say healthcare professionals, again, let's try and be more specific. Do we mean, say, all doctors of a particular specialty, like all general practitioners, say all pediatric nurses, from a particular country even, right? Maybe all dentists in Australia. Try and get specific when we're thinking about all of that. Maybe we're thinking about government or a special interest group. Maybe we're thinking about the general public or a patient group, a specific group of patients, or the whole general public. Get as specific as possible. So we want to figure out exactly who needs to hear your message. And it might be one audience, it might be a bunch of these. Write them all down. And then again, go back to your authors and make sure that everybody agrees. Once we've decided our authors, it's time to choose a journal. Decide where this paper is going. And I have a question for you. Why are we choosing the journal already now, before we've even started to write? So why are we choosing the journal at this stage? Why don't we write the whole manuscript first and then pick a journal? To save time in case it was rejected, to know the style that we follow in writing. Each journal has its own style. Great, these are great answers, guys. To save time by finding the style, each journal has a unique format. They all have different guidelines. Exactly, guys. Great. It's going to help us to plan better. It's going to make us avoid huge edits. It is really frustrating to write an entire 6,000 word article and then to realize that your journal choice only allows, say, 3,000 words, and they've got a limit on the figures, and they use completely different headings from the ones that you used. It's very frustrating. Ask me how I know. So we want to choose a journal. So step one, you want to come up with a fairly long list of potential journals that match your academic or clinical specialty. And you can do that by looking at, what are you reading? So to prepare for this piece of research, where were you reading? Where's the paper that you wish you'd done? Where's that been published? And then things like where others publish. So where does your collaborators publish? Where does your supervisor publish? Where do your competitors publish? The paper you wish you wrote. And then things like systematic reviews. Look at where your favorite review on this topic is published, systematic or narrative reviews. And then the things that that review cites, where are those published? And this starts giving you an idea of journals. And hopefully, if you've been doing a lot of preparation for this research, you've been reading a lot. So you've got a sense of the journals that where this piece of work would fit. But now we need to narrow the list. Sorry, I'm just going to admit another person. And we're going to do that by looking at a few different things. So first up, let's look at our message. Compare it to these journals' scopes and aims and see if it matches. Mismatch between your message and the journal scope is one of the main reasons for desk rejection by editors. It can be really simple things, like some journals don't publish qualitative research, some journals don't publish case reports, some journals love replications, some really don't. So check those scope and aims to save yourself a desk rejection. Then look at who your audience is and compare it to the journal's readership. Are you going to reach the people that you need to? It might be more useful to publish in a smaller journal that everyone you want to reach reads versus a big journal that very few people of your audience reads. So it's worth thinking about that. Something else to think about is, if this research has been funded, go back to those funders and look at what they require. Some funders are going to ask you to publish in particular ways, kinds of open access, for instance. So make sure you're checking every single funder requirement by writing your acknowledgement section now and getting all of your co-authors to check it so you can make sure you're following everybody's guidelines. So again, we're going to have to also look at, what do our authors need? This is another step in trying to shorten that list, narrow that list. You might need to balance timing and prestige. For instance, maybe somebody in your research team needs a certain number of papers quickly to graduate because their graduation date's coming up and they're not allowed to graduate unless they have X papers. So you might choose a journal that has a higher acceptance rate and maybe isn't quite so prestigious. Or maybe no one's in a rush and you've maybe got some time to try a more prestigious journal and maybe risk a rejection or two, knowing that it will take time to format between each rejection, or maybe to deal with a lot around peer review. So you're judging these two issues. Prestige is an interesting concept when it comes to journals, and you'll notice that I haven't said anything about impact factor as yet. So the problem with just using impact factor is it's a really crude measure of quality. It just tells you about the average number of citations in the last 2 years in that journal. The reality is that yes, in some institutions will still require you to have published in journals with a certain impact factor, say for tenure decisions or for graduation decisions. So you might have to look at those things at some point. But I would really suggest looking at other criteria as much as you can first, almost, to find a good match for your story and for your audience before looking at impact factor, rather than just relying on impact factor as a crude measure. And there's one more criterion that you need to apply to your journal shortlist. They all need to be real academic journals. So predatory journals, they will still publish your article. These are journals that claim to be academic journals. They will take your paper, they will peer review it, kind of, and they'll publish it. But it's not going to get proper peer review. And it's not going to be published somewhere where people can find it. It's not going to be properly databased. It's basically the same as just popping your research up on your own blog. So, warning signs, whether a particular journal is fake. The direct email. Who has gotten one of those direct emails that say, oh, you published such amazing research. We would love for you to publish with us. Hassan, I'm getting to how to figure out those journals. Hold tight, that's a good question. So who's gotten some of these direct emails that are encouraging you to publish with that person when you've never heard of this journal before? Anyone got one of those? The moment you publish this article, you'll probably start to get those emails. You end up on mailing lists. Basically, I get them all the time too, and they're usually a sign that the journal's not a real one. So yeah, Hassan's gotten a lot of those emails before. Exactly. So the idea is, if you've worked with a journal before, then okay. Then if they get in touch with you, makes sense. But if it's a journal that you've never worked with before, it's a bad sign. And one of these bad signs on its own maybe is fine, but you'll look at lots of these bad signs together. Other bad signs are things like really, really low article processing fees, right? Really low article processing charges for open access. And not just that, but they shout about them. So when you go to their website, they don't say, oh, look at our great research, read this great research. It's all about publish with us, publish with us, publish with us. We're really cheap, we're really fast. That's a warning sign. And also that very fast, they offer super fast peer review. When somebody says to you they can get you proper peer review in 24 to 48 hours, you know there's a problem, right? We know that it takes editors a long time to find peer reviewers. Good peer reviewers, research scientists out there are busy, busy folks. Clinicians out there are busy, busy folks, right? So 24 hours, 48 hours to get good peer review, unlikely. And then when they do peer review, you get few to no comments. And it's all comments like, oh, this journal is amazing, you should just publish it, right? Those are things to watch out for. Basically, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Abdallah, yes, checking whether a journal is indexed or not is a really good idea, because if it's indexed, it's a better marker of quality. And that's one of the things that's actually listed in this great checklist. So Hassan, you were asking, how do you know which of these journals, whether a journal is not great or not? Think, Check, Submit has a wonderful checklist that you can go through, which gives you some questions to ask whether a journal is real or not. So authors a list of 3 journals in order of which you'll be going for them. So that you've then got, this is our journal, our target journal. So we've got our first choice journal, but we're not going to start writing yet. We're going to go and grab those instructions for authors. Because as you all said earlier, we want to be able to follow those while we're preparing the manuscript. So we're going to go and have a good read through those instructions and pull out the information that relates to your kind of article. One of the really useful things that many of these journal instructions mentions is reporting guidelines, which I mentioned right at the beginning. So, but quick question, who had heard of reporting guidelines before? Had you heard of them? And if you had you used them? If you've not, I'd love to know that too. So had you heard of reporting guidelines before this workshop? No, excellent, fantastic, Heba. No, Ursa, great, yay. Asma's heard of them, has not used them yet. Ali, Ola, not heard. This is great. I love that so many of you had not heard about them because we are really excited about reaching new people and bringing reporting guidelines to them. So this is awesome. So what is a reporting guideline? Reporting guidelines are reminders of the minimum information that readers need for a particular paper, for a particular study design. They're usually given as a really simple checklist of items. The one on screen right now is CONSORT, which is the reporting guideline for clinical trials. And you can see this is page 1 of 2, and there's 11 different items here, different things that as a reviewer or a reader or a user would need to fully understand and use this particular study design. And these, you can see that there was only a couple of items on introduction, but lots on the methods. They tend to focus on the methods and the results. So you might be wondering, why do we need these reminders? Remember stuff about my study, but the reality is we don't. When you've spent years of your life on a piece of work, it's such second nature, it's so obvious to you, you forget what other people won't know. And we can think about a really silly example. I don't know about you, but if I need to go shopping and I look in the cupboard before I leave and say I need 3 things, milk and bread and eggs, and I leave and I walk to the shop, by the time I get to the shop and I'm standing in, I usually have forgotten at least one of those. I make myself a shopping list. And our research is so much more important than our shopping list, right? And for a more serious example, checklists turn up, for instance, in aircrafts and flights. So it doesn't matter how often a flight crew's flown together, they go through that pre-flight checklist every time because people can forget something, even if they've done it 100 times. So if you're wondering where you can find checklist for the particular study design. So they'll say, if you're using a trial, use CONSORT. If you're writing about an observational study, use STROBE. A lot of them will also just point you straight to our website, and you've got the address in your handouts. It's equator-network.org, and this is our website. And you can search through our list of, I think we're now on over 400 reporting guidelines. You can search for a relevant checklist by your study design and your clinical area. But what you can also do is we've gathered together the big common general reporting guidelines for each study design on our homepage, and you could just click that and have that checklist ready to go. So those are instructions for reporting for your manuscript. We've collected all of those up, and that means we've finished planning our manuscript. And just to check, were there any planning questions before we move on? Okay, great. As I said, keep popping questions into the box if you have any questions, if I've missed anything or you'd like me to repeat anything. All clear. Fabulous. Thanks so much, Ezra. Right, so now we are going to move on to writing the manuscript. So our next 4 steps are about writing. So first we're going to pull everything, we're going to use everything we've pulled together so far to develop an outline. Now, who else gets completely stressed out by a blank page? Oh, Balquiz asked, is there reporting guidelines for case reports? Yes, there are. CARE is a reporting guideline for case reports. So I don't know if anybody else gets completely stressed out by the blank page. I really do. It freaks me out, which I don't know why, because it's not like we're going to mess up a real piece of paper. We're working on a screen. But somehow that blank page, oh, there is some agreement, voila, awesome. So we're going to help with that by breaking up that page as our first writing step. So we're going to break it up. We're going to go grab our instructions for authors, and we're going to see what are the main headings we need in the articles. Abdallah, does giving participants financial reward interfere with being an author? Participants would usually not be authors, if that helps. So if your study participants would usually not be authors unless they are study participants who are involved in doing the research, planning the research. So if you're doing any patient and participant involvement in your research, that would be someone who would be an author. I hope that helps. So grab your author instructions, see what are the main headings you need in the article. Usually articles follow an IMRAD structure. So IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. That's our general structure, and some journals also want a conclusion at the end. But don't stop there. The instructions for authors will often ask for a bunch of other things like conflicts of interest, plain language summary, an acknowledgement section, a funding section, maybe something on data sharing, as I said, conflicts of interest. So grab all of those headings and pop them into your document. And all of a sudden, you've got something like 20 words in your document already, and it already feels better. You've broken it up a wee bit. But once you've had it in the headings, don't just stop there. Add in the subheadings. Brainstorm in your author team as well. What's going to go into each of those sections? What do you need to cover under each main heading? And your instructions for authors will help here as well. For instance, things like the abstract. The instructions for authors will say whether it needs to be structured with subheadings or unstructured with no subheadings. And your reporting guideline will be really helpful here, particularly for the methods and results. You can go through the reporting guideline, and for each item, pop in a short subheading. And you might end up editing these out later, but for now, they're a great reminder when writing. And as a last step, I like to go through the instructions for authors and pull out any extra information that I think might be helpful in writing and pop it into comments on the documents. Things like the word counts for particular sections, or maybe if there's an item for the reporting guideline that I'm not so familiar with, maybe pull the text from the reporting guideline that explains what should be in there, popping all that into the comments to help. So we've got our outline. Now we're going to be doing the next step. We're going to get a rough draft together. So you can start filling in all of the information under each heading and subheading. And I'm going to talk really briefly now about what each of the sections in the manuscript should cover, just each of these 4 sections, because we don't have that much time. Yes, I like suggesting you can gain help from previous papers that contain the same topic or idea as yours. Really good idea. So we're first going to look at the introduction. The introduction or background, it answers that big key question of what didn't we know before the study started. And in biomedical research, it's generally made up of 4 sections that cover sort of 3 to 4 paragraphs. So the first section is a general overview of the academic area. You tend to cite a few big key papers here and tell us where we are in academic research and why it's important. The next section describes evidence gap or the problems. You'll cite quite a bit more here, and you'll show what is this thing that we don't know in this area that you've introduced to us in the first section. And then in the third section, you'll hone in on which bit of the evidence gap you're tackling. So what is your research question, or what's your hypothesis? And in the final section, which is usually part of the same paragraph as the previous section, or might be a second paragraph, it's then going to talk about how you planned to fill that evidence gap or answer that question. So you're going to describe your study design. In some fields, you'd also give an overview of your main findings here, but that's more common in the life sciences than in biomedical. Read through a few articles from your target journal to see if people do that. So for each section, I'm just going to give you 3 quick tips. So for introduction, first off, the length. It does not need to be super long. Literally is 3 to 4 paragraphs. Rather spend words on your discussion. We have a habit of putting too many words in our intros and not enough in our discussions. Shorter intro, longer discussion. Second, the introduction is not a whole literature review. You're not trying to cite every single paper ever written on your topic here. You just can't. And related, you don't need to go back to the very beginning of your field and give a history of your field, unless you're writing a narrative review. In just a regular research article, you wouldn't. Essentially, your introduction should just give us enough to understand your research topic, to understand why the study is happening. So what did you do and why? That's what you need to give enough information in your introduction. So that was your introduction. Next up is the method section, which is the recipe for your study. Now you want to give enough detail for somebody to repeat your study, to try and replicate it, to use your methods. You also want to give enough detail for a peer reviewer to judge the validity or generalizability, for a reader to be able to read it and go, ah, I can see what this applies to. I can see how far this applies to my group of patients. And so 3 tips and methods. Firstly, you need to report every single aspect of the study design. Often you'll see a paper has gaps, say they will describe their intervention really well, but not mention the sample size, or they'll barely talk about their statistical analysis. So again, this is where your reporting guideline can be really helpful in guiding you in how much detail to give in each section. Secondly, be careful not to let results slip into the methods. Anything you knew before the study is methods. So like what your eligibility criteria are. And anything that you could only know after the study is results. So like how many people you actually recruited. Asma, should all of the sentences in the introduction be as a citation for other papers, or may it be from our own words? Great question. I would encourage you to always write in your own words. So when you cite, citing doesn't mean copying. So citing means I'm saying where I got the idea from. I'm saying where the information was where I read the information, but I'm not copying and pasting. And ideally, you never copy and paste. Ideally, you read a paper, you think about what the thing is you want to take from that paper, and then you write it in your own words and you cite it. To avoiding plagiarism is when you have when you've copied, and then you don't just cite, but you actually put it in quotation marks in the little bunny rabbit ears to say, look, I have taken a much better idea, particularly with things like introductions, to read, understand, and then write in your own words, and then you still say where you got it from, you got the idea from, which is the citing. So Asma, no, you do need to reference. You do need to reference if you're using your own words, because you took the idea from somewhere else. So you have to say where the idea came from, but if it's written in your own words, you don't have to put it in quotation marks. Does that make sense? So let me know if you'd like that repeated at all. Great, awesome. So yeah, I would really encourage you, folks are always worried about plagiarism, and I would say plagiarism, you could start having worries with plagiarism if you're ever doing copy paste. Just never copy paste. Always read and paraphrase, and then still say where you got the idea from. And then you've got that perfect circle of you're writing in your own words, which is the best way to write, and we'll talk a lot about that next week. But you're also saying where you got the ideas from, so you're part of the scientific body. Cool. Okay, so oh yes, is it allowed to cite others' methodology if we're working on the same idea? So you would definitely want, if you are using methods that you took from somewhere else, definitely cite. So with everything, if you have gotten an idea from somewhere else, cite it. Always, always, always cite it. Say where you got ideas from. It's a great idea to do. It's just part of the currency of academia. We always want to say where we got our ideas from. So the other thing last thing to think about for methods is to keep justifications of your methods out of the methods and in the discussion. So what do I mean by that? What you did is methods. So I couldn't blind my participants, but I did blind my assessors. Why I did it, what the effect was, what I could have done different is discussion. So the fact that there was no possible placebo and that I minimized bias in these other ways, that's discussion. Method is just literally what I did. So that was the methods, questions, that was great. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the results. So the results are trying to answer that big question, what did you find? And it can be really helpful to have the results follow the flow of the methods. So essentially results then follows the flow so that every method has a matching result, which is a really important thing you want to make sure. You don't want a method cited that there's no result for. Again, go back to your reporting guideline for what is expected for a particular study design. That's really helpful. And check the instructions for authors for whether to show the figures and tables in their manuscript position or at the end of the document or as separate files. So see what the instructions for authors says about that. So 3 tips for results. When you're writing, you have options for how you present your results. You can present them as tables, figures, or text. But what's really important is pick one per result. Pick one per result. So when you have data in figures and tables, great, you need to reference and integrate those figures and tables. So there always needs to be something in the text that goes, oh, figure 1 is showing, but you don't want to just repeat all of the information. So you see it a lot with tables. There'll be a table with data and then every single number will be repeated in the text. We don't need to do that. Don't do that. Second tip, is to give all of your results. We talk a lot about negative results as if they're this bad thing. Give all of your results. Negative results are not bad things. They're part of the scientific story. So if you measured lots of outcomes, then report all of those outcomes, even the ones that were a bit boring. And finally, don't let interpretation creep into the results. So your results section is for just describing and summarizing. So saying, oh, all the green things grew and all the red things didn't. But interpreting why that happened, that maybe saying green promotes growth in this particular way, you leave that in the discussion. Exactly, yes, no result is a result. We've got another question. Reporting guidelines classified according to study design regardless of the field. So that's a really good question. You've got your reporting guidelines for the general study design, and then in a lot of fields, they have developed things called extensions or applications, where they take that reporting guideline and then they say, well, if you were using this reporting guideline in, say, psychology, you would need to think about these things in addition. And if you go to our website, you can find the extensions, but always start with the big general reporting guideline, the one that isn't dependent on field. So start there. Cool. So that was the results. Now we can do the discussion. The discussion is answering the big question, what do the results mean? Again, it's made up of 4 sections, kind of mirroring the introduction, but it's much longer than the introduction. So the first section, which is 1 paragraph, summarizes the key findings. You're not going to repeat every single number, just sum up the big key finding. Then there's the second section, which is way longer paragraph. Take as many paragraphs as you need. And this is going to be putting your results in context. You're effectively comparing your results to the body of knowledge already out there. So is each result surprising or is it expected? What might be the mechanism behind that result? Does that result change our understanding of anything? Spend time here talking through your results and citing lots of literature as you put your results into context. The third section is the justifications for your design choices. So that's the strengths and weaknesses of your study design. So every decision that you made that isn't obvious or that required you and your team to really think things through, talk about it here. And the final section sometimes has a separate heading as conclusions, depending on the journal, but the final section is the conclusion. It's 1 paragraph. And you're going to summarize your whole message again. So you're going to repeat the evidence gap, what you found, what it means, and crucially, what you want readers to do next. So that's summing up that discussion. Now, 3 tips for discussion. What we mean by that is no new information of yours. So if it isn't in a result, if it's not presented as a result, it cannot go in the discussion. So check your discussion. Sometimes this creeps in. If you talk about a data point in the discussion, it better be in the results. Secondly, give the full story. So you need to talk about literature that both agrees and disagrees with you. Don't just talk about stuff that's agreeing with you. So give that holistic view of the literature and of your work. And finally, avoid spin. Avoid spin. Now, spin is using language to change how somebody interprets our results. Can anybody think of an example of spin to pop it in the comment box? What would you think of as what kind of language would you think is spin language? Would to change how people view the results? Anybody who's got an example of spin? Okay, so I think folks, maybe this is, never heard of it. Great, thank you for that feedback. Okay, so you've never heard of spin. This is excellent. So spin is using language to make your results, it works in 2 ways. It's either to make your results sound more impressive than they actually are. So they're good results, they're exciting results, good results in inverted commas. But we're going to use language to make them sound even cooler. So we're going to say things like, oh, we've got a perfect association between 2 things, or this is going to be paradigm shifting. That's language that's completely unnecessary, right? It's bigging up things. It's making it sound more impressive than it is. The other way we can use spin, which is also equally bad, if not worse, it's using language to make a not so exciting result sound exciting. So if something hasn't been significant, it's like level of significance, and now we want to say things like, oh, it's fine, it's trending towards significance, or it's almost significant. It's using language like that. We don't need to use any of this language. All of this spin language is completely unnecessary and just messes with how people view our results. So just let the results speak themselves. Only be as strong. This is the first study conducted in my country about this topic, is not spin, because that's factual. So that's factual. Spin is where you start adding overconfidence, and it's not based in evidence. So if you know something's the first study, that's great. You're not making anything up, and you're letting the reader take that from take from that what they will. So that's a lovely sentence to use and useful information for the reader. It's not spin, so that's completely fine. Okay, so that was spin. So that was a short description of what goes into a journal article. But now you might be going, oh, okay, but still, there's still a lot to write. And I know I've put my headings and subheadings, but oof, it still can be tricky. Where do you think is the easiest place to start writing in that journal article? Abdallah, interestingly, surprisingly, etc. We will talk about those words next week when we start talking about editing and things. Oh, so Loa is suggesting results, Heba suggesting methods. Yes, I like to start with, so some folks really like starting with results. I like starting with methods personally. I like starting with methods because there's no creative thought required. You've done the thing, right? You've done it. So yeah, not the abstract or the introduction. Yes, definitely. So you start with the methods because it's the thing you've done. So there's no creative thought, you know exactly what you did, you just plop it down. And then move on to the results because it follows logically from the methods. And again, it's what you found. There's no creative thought required. It's just what you found. And that tends to lead logically into the discussion because if you've ever started writing about a piece of research, you get excited when you start writing about your results, and you naturally start to write some discussion because you want to talk about your results. So it flows very naturally. And only at that point would I write the introduction. So often we get stuck trying to write the introduction and feeling like we haven't read enough. Whereas if you write the rest first, the introduction will flow quite naturally. So yes, methods and results and discussion. At that point, you can write the abstract and the title, which are basically just summaries of the rest of it. They're just summaries. They just answer those 4 big questions again. So now we've got our rough draft together. Great. Now you can start to revise and polish it. So essentially, I'm suggesting that you separate out the process of generating new text from editing your text, from playing with your own text and getting it right. Essentially, we're borrowing from the world of fiction writing here. You'll hear all the time in creative writing classes to write first, then edit. Because when you're editing at the same time as you're writing, you stop generating new texts, you're not progressing, and it sort of blocks the flow of ideas. It can be really helpful to let yourself just write, regardless of how many mistakes or how imperfect the sentences are. You can then come back and edit them later, but it's much easier to edit something that's already there. So just let yourself write that rough draft in one go and then come back and edit. And as I mentioned earlier, we're actually going to spend the whole of our next webinar talking about revising. We're going to talk about academic style and language, and we're going to talk about what to look for during the revision stage to get things into that perfectly nice, tight, simple, clear, complete. That's what we're going to talk about next time. Oh, this is a great question. Can we ask for somebody else to edit it, as they might have different ideas? So you've got a whole team of co-authors, so it'd be a really good idea for all of your co-authors to be working on a document. That's really helpful. Oh, somebody's mic's not mute. Sorry, can I just ask everybody to mute their mics? We've got somebody. Hang on.
I think, Jen, you can mute that person.
Yep, there we go.
Okay, thanks.
There we go. Cool. Sorry about that, guys. So definitely get everybody in the author team to be working on a manuscript and to get their ideas. And then we can talk more next time about editing if you want to get other folks involved in editing. So once you've got a draft manuscript together, remember you want to send each for their approval. So once you've got a polished manuscript and you and all of your co-authors are happy with that manuscript, you need a few extra documents before you're ready to head to the journal website and start the submission process. So consider writing a cover letter to go with your paper. It doesn't need to be long, just a page or so. And you use the cover letter to tell the editor why they should want this paper, why they should get excited. So how does the paper fit their journal scope and aims? Why will their readers be interested in this paper? How does it fit into existing conversations in this journal and in the field in general? So tell people all of these things. And also just check the instructions for authors. Some journals will also ask you to add in statements about ethical approval and prior publication in the cover letter. The second thing to think about is to consider filling in a reporting guideline checklist. So just go through that checklist and mark on it on for each item, which page of the manuscript that item appears. And you'll submit that alongside the manuscript. A lot of journals will ask you to do this. And then the last would be declarations. So some journals will also ask you to fill in a separate conflicts of interest declaration or an authorship declaration. Again, just check the instructions for authors to see what your journal needs. So now you've got all those pesky documents together, ready to go, and we've finished all of our writing steps. But wait, the final step before you submit is to have everything approved by every co-author. You've been doing this at each step anyway, so it's a formality. No one's going to be surprised by what you've written. But every version that you submit to a journal has to be approved by every co-author. That is part of the authorship criteria. It's criteria number 3. And now your manuscript is ready to go. So we've gone through the 10 steps for preparing a manuscript for publication. The first 5 steps were all about planning before we even put pen to paper. We decided the message, we confirmed the authors, we decided who we were writing for, and then we picked a target journal and checked their instructions for authors and some other useful guidelines. Then the next 4 steps got our manuscript ready for submission. So we set up an outline, we wrote a rough draft, we've polished and revised that rough draft, and we've got supporting documents together. And then our last step, which is threaded through every other step, is getting final approval from every co-author for the whole manuscript. So I hope you all now feel ready to get writing, and that you're ready to go from that completed piece of research to a manuscript that is ready for submission. And the main message I want you to go away with, again, is planning, planning, planning. Make that solid plan up front. You do not have to do this from scratch. There's loads of tools available. And at every stage, get all of your co-authors to agree on everything. So before I take some last questions, I'd like you all to take a moment and think of one practical, concrete thing that you're going to do with the information from this workshop. It's Friday evening, so let's say it's something you're going to do next week. What are you going to do with this information you've learned today, so that you can, it's not just information, you didn't just spend an hour hanging out. Like, let's do something concrete. So pop it in the comment box. What is the one concrete thing, your one next step with what we've covered over the last hour? So just have a think about that and pop it into the comment box. Revise these notes, cool. Share with my co-authors a recording of this lecture, nice. These are some nice next steps. Anything else? Let's hear one more. Plan to publish my case, make the plan. Excellent. For your case report, so you want CARE. CARE is your reporting guideline, C-A-R-E. It's a lovely one. Great. So thank you so much for your time, guys. I really appreciate that you've spent this time with me. I'm looking forward to any of your last questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's really great, and I really enjoyed it. We'll take maybe 3 or maybe maximum 3 questions, because people, you know.
Yeah, no, I realize it's 6 o'clock on the dot for you guys. Well, sorry, 7 o'clock on the dot for you guys, 5 o'clock here. So I'm sure everybody is ready to go and grab something to eat.
I have a very quick question, actually.
Sure.
Maybe you might have an answer, like you want to delay it to the next lecture. But Islam, I think, mentioned about the paraphrasing.
Yes.
Is it okay or considered plagiarism?
So it depends what you mean by paraphrasing. If by paraphrasing you mean I want to copy paste a sentence and change one word, no, that's not okay. If by paraphrasing you mean I read it and then I thought about it and then I wrote it in my own words, that's fine. So never ever copy paste and try and change individual words. It just doesn't work. 100% of the time, what you could do is rather read it, think about it, write it in your own words. It can feel like maybe that's going to be harder, but it's going to make your editing process much, much easier, because it'll make everything hang together better because it's in your own words.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Cool. So are there any other questions? No, that looks like everyone's, I mean, you guys have been great about asking questions the whole way through, which is awesome. I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys next time. We'll talk about scientific language and style. It's going to be very interactive, so come with your typing fingers ready. We're going to do lots of editing and revising. And then oh, sorry, there's one last question. Read, understand. Read, understand, and then write what you understood in your own language. So either in your own language, in your own words, exactly. Writing in your own words is really, really helpful. Islam, it's really helpful. Cool. So there's a few people who said thank you, and a few people who said that they're waiting to, they're excited for next week, which is awesome. I'm excited too. So yeah, And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me, and I hope you're all keeping safe and well.